after 2 months of having this car on their lot and in their shop, the mechanic said, listen, we can't figure out what's going on with it. We're giving up. Learning how to work on your own cars is the best time investment you could possibly make, because this car behind me took 2 years to be properly diagnosed, and even a professional mechanic couldn't fix it. But after 2 years of work being done on this car, it's finally fixed, and I'm going to tell you how I did it myself. So like I said, this all started 2 years ago when my sister's Nissan Versa here decided to light itself up like a Christmas tree. It threw just about every single code you could possibly imagine, and every light across the dashboard lit up. Now at the time I actually knew very little about working on cars and had just picked up my very first project car, which is the 1975 Camaro way in the background there. So my sister, not being able to rely on me to help her with it, did the reasonable thing and took the vehicle to a mechanic. Now when my sister took the car into the mechanic, the lights on the dashboard included the check engine light, the power steering light, the ABS light, the TPMS light, and the low voltage light. Basically, you probably couldn't get more lights on the dashboard if you tried. Now the most serious symptom that she was experiencing on this car and was relayed to the mechanic was that when stopping, this car would randomly stall. And that'd be at like stoplights, at drive-thrus, all of it. Anytime the car wasn't moving, it would stall out. Now there's about 18 million different reasons why a car would stall, and almost every single one of them has to do with air-fuel ratios. But when she took this into the mechanic, he diagnosed her with a bad transmission that cost $3,500 to replace. Now granted, it's a Nissan Versa, these things are notorious for having bad CVT transmissions, but unsurprisingly, after spending all of that money getting a brand new transmission, thankfully with a warranty on it, it still didn't fix the problem. Now after that, the mechanic spent 2 months diagnosing this car, trying to figure out why it still had problems. And while the mechanic was professionally diagnosing everything, I was in the background doing my amateur work trying to learn more and more about this car so I could lend a helping hand. Now in a crazy turn of events, after 2 months of having this car on their lot and in their shop, the mechanic said, listen, we can't figure out what's going on with it, we're giving up. Now at the time that this was all happening, I was actually living up in Kentucky, and as many of you know, I lived there for the last 3 years and periodically visited my family down here in Florida throughout that time. So every single time I came to Florida, I would work on this car a little bit here and there, try and figure out things, run diagnostics, plug my computer in, see what was going on with it, and I could never get enough time with it to really figure out what was going wrong. But I did what every amateur mechanic does and spent hours and hours on YouTube and online forums trying to figure out what was going on, and that's where I found out that most of the stalling problems with cars come from air-fuel issues. So that led me down a path of replacing just about every single thing that has to do with the air-fuel ratios on this car. Starting with the mass airflow sensor, the PCV valve, the PCV hoses to make sure that there were no vacuum leaks, and the air filter to make sure that it wasn't suffocating the engine. And unsurprisingly, those didn't work. So again, in the meantime, I had to go back to Kentucky and leave this car alone for a while. And my sister, being too scared to drive it on the roads because it was stalling and killing itself, she decided to send it back to a different mechanic to take a look at it, and was driving my mom's car for the longest time while he had it in his shop. Now while that mechanic had it, he diagnosed it with a faulty fuel pump that wasn't able to deliver the fuel with enough pressure needed to run the engine. Now even at the time, I thought that was a little bit weird because it ran totally fine most of the time, but at idle was the only time where it would stall out and kill itself. But again, I wasn't here to double check any of his work or really talk to him much about any of the diagnosis on it, so my sister said, let's do it, just replace the fuel pump, I want to be done with this whole issue, I want my car working again. Now wouldn't you believe it, the car still stalled out at stoplights after the fuel pump was replaced. And frankly, I think she should have gotten her money back for the whole repair, but there was a brand new part put into it, so at least I know that that's not going to fail in the future. Now at this point, we made the wise decision to not send the car back to the mechanic again. We said, listen, we'll take it, we'll put it back in the garage, it's going to sit there until I moved back to Florida and could take a real deep dive into this thing with proper computers and diagnostic tools, and talk to a couple experts about what's going on with everything in this car. Now in the meantime of my family waiting for me to move back to Florida, this car threw a purge valve code. Now the purge valve is a small valve located under the hood on this car that controls the flow of vapor gases from the charcoal canister up to the engine. Almost every single modern vehicle has an evaporative emissions system on it. It's an EPA required piece of equipment. And if you live in a state that requires annual inspections on your car, they will fail it for your EVAP system not operating properly. Thankfully in Florida, we don't have that problem, so this wasn't a huge issue. But it was the first official clue of what was going wrong with this car. So I replaced the purge valve, thinking that'll be it. That'll be the fix. It won't stall anymore. And lo and behold, it didn't fix it. It was still stalling regularly at stoplights. It didn't even improve it a little bit. So then at this point, I'm fully moved down to Florida. I live here now. I'm able to really dig into this car. I'm able to drive it around for hours with computers hooked up to it to try and figure out what's going on. And finally, my computer indicates that cylinder 3 is misfiring on the car. So we pulled the spark plugs and the coil packs out, replaced those, and it ran a little bit better, but it still stalled out at stoplights. But in all of my diagnosing, I slowly realized that if I disconnected all of the purge hoses from the engine itself, the car ran completely fine. It was almost as if the fuel vapors that were coming through the EVAP system were too strong and were choking the engine out. So that led me to diagnosing every single piece of the EVAP system to see if it worked properly. Now, around the same time, I spoke to a Nissan expert, my friend Derek, who works at DRZA Auto, who you might have seen in my video where I got some aluminum welding done on my Camaro. And he said if you've got stalling issues and it seems to be related to the EVAP system, check the charcoal canister itself and see if it's saturated with really heavy liquid fuel or dense fuel fumes. So I pulled the charcoal canister off and took a look at it, and wouldn't you know, it was pretty much full of liquid fuel. And when liquid fuel touches the charcoal that's inside of it, it breaks it down into this dense paste-like substance and stops fuel vapors from moving through it properly. And when the valves open, it delivers a dense cloud of fuel vapor straight up to the engine. Now, when that happens, it can trigger a fuel too rich code, which is one of the problems that this car had. So I figured, well, let's go ahead and replace the charcoal canister itself. I found one on eBay that was an OEM part taken directly off of a 2011 Nissan Versa, and I pulled the trigger and had it shipped here. And while we were waiting for the new charcoal canister to arrive, we also ordered a brand new charcoal canister vent valve, which sits directly on the charcoal canister and controls the flow of fresh air into the charcoal canister itself. Now, just a quick recap at this point in time. The parts that we have replaced would be the PCV system in its entirety, the mass airflow sensor, the air filter, the fuel pump, the CVT transmission, now the charcoal canister, and the charcoal canister vent valve. End of recap. That's everything we've replaced. It's a lot of parts. So after installing the new charcoal canister and the new valve, everything seemed to be working well. All of the EVAP flow codes went away, the too rich code went away, but the car would still occasionally stall when under load going uphill. And it would stall right as I let off the gas. And that was the only time that I could get it to reliably stall out. Now, once again, I unplugged the purge valve from the engine up front, and everything worked fine. It wouldn't stall no matter what. Now, after replacing all of these parts, I was really annoyed that the same janky solution, quote unquote, that was working before is still the only thing solving my stalling problem. Now, at this point in the process, I had spent well over 100 hours between diagnosing, researching, driving this thing around, installing parts, ordering parts, and I was ready to send this car to the junkyard and just say, go get a new one. But I knew in my mind, if I was able to fix it, it would be an incredibly satisfying experience to say, hey, professional mechanics, you couldn't figure this out, or you wouldn't invest the time to figure it out, and I was able to. So I chugged forward with my diagnostic process to continue trying to figure out what was going on with this car. Now, during one of my diagnostic sessions, I let the car run for about 2 hours with the parking brake pulled and the car in drive. And I started to realize that every single time the AC compressor would kick in, it would put a huge load on the engine and almost stall it out. I'm talking like 400 RPMs it would come down to, and the engine would just sound like it was ready to And that's not a good sound. You don't want to hear that coming from your engine. So I started digging into things that might have to do with the AC compressor. And all of those are very expensive and usually fairly work intensive. And it can be anything from bad bearings to a bad compressor in and of itself. And I didn't want to deal with emptying the refrigerant, so I tabled that as a hopefully it is the worst case option. Now, the one thing I did notice about the AC compressor issues from other people online is that typically if the compressor had an issue and it was bogging the engine down that much, the actual AC system itself wouldn't get cold. Now, this car I actually uploaded a video on about a year ago talking about fixing the AC system, and it blows cold air just fine. So I was pretty confident that the AC compressor itself was not actually a problem and had nothing to do with the engine stalling out. But through my research, I came across a fella online who made a video talking about how his car was dying out every single time the AC compressor kicked in. And the reason it was dying out was because the idle air control valve, otherwise known to most people as the throttle body, was not opening and closing and adapting to the different change in load on the engine to spike the RPMs and give it enough power to run all of the accessories. When your AC kicks in, when your alternator is charging, if you have any other accessories connected directly to the engine via drive belts, when those kick on, they increase the load on your engine and it has to raise the RPMs a little bit to maintain idle. So I pulled apart the throttle body, and wouldn't you believe it, it was disgusting. It was so caked in charcoal and nastiness that it took me like an hour to scrub everything out, because you gotta be really, really careful with it as to not damage the plate or the surrounding area. It's a very delicate system. It's computerized to let only a very certain amount of air in, depending on how much fuel is going into the system, so you need to be really, really careful when you work on it. Now, after cleaning up the idle control valve, this thing was running better than it had in years, and it was almost never stalling. But almost isn't good enough, because it still would stall out almost immediately after filling itself up with gas. And everything online pointed to issues with the purge valves and the charcoal canister and the EVAP valves. And in my mind, I knew I had replaced all of those already, so I completely wrote them off as problems. Now, just because you replaced a part doesn't necessarily mean it's not still a problem, and I learned that on this process very quickly. Now, the reason that the car was still stalling, mostly after filling up with gas, was the purge valve up in the front of the engine. Again, this is one of the first parts that we ever replaced in this entire saga. What was happening is that in its default state, the purge valve is supposed to be completely closed. There should be no air getting through it whatsoever. And this is the purge valve that we ordered and was on the car. Now, if I blow through it, again, it's unplugged, it's off. There should be no air flowing through it whatsoever, but if I blow through it, you'll be able to hear the airflow coming through. Now, it's not a lot of air, but it is some air. And some air is too much air for this valve to be considered in working order. It is supposed to be not even a molecule of air, a complete and total vacuum seal. And because that valve wasn't sealing off the vacuum, it meant that the engine was pulling a constant vacuum on the fuel tank, and as the vacuum in the fuel tank increased and increased, it actually overloaded the fuel pump to the point that the fuel pump wasn't able to deliver enough fuel up to the engine. So in a way, the mechanic that diagnosed the fuel pressure issue was kind of correct. But it was because there was too much vacuum being pulled on the fuel tank for any fuel to go through the fuel system. So we ordered a new purge valve from Nissan directly, and that thing showed up in lickety-split time. We got it installed, and there was no more stalling issue. Now, I will say, when you're starting to work on cars, you're probably in a similar spot to where I was, where you don't want to spend a ton of money on parts. This thing was about $23 on Amazon when we bought it, and the replacement OEM part from Nissan was over $100. But the difference is, your car will actually probably work after you install the OEM part. Now, I'm not saying don't order anything from Amazon, but be a little bit careful with it. Check part numbers, make sure that the reviews are good, and check your products when they first come in, so if they don't work, you can return them and get your money back. So the stalling had stopped completely on the car. No matter what we did, we could not get the car to stall again. Awesome, really, really good, except 24 hours after making that repair, the car threw a code for a minor EVAP system leak. and I was on the edge of just giving up at this point. In my mind, the car was working, it was fixed enough. It wasn't stalling, but this is my sister's car, and if a check engine issue comes up that's actually serious, I want her to know that that is serious. So having a check engine light on for a minor EVAP system leak is not going to be helpful for anybody. It's just going to block any potential reminder that something is actually going wrong. So I picked myself up a smoke machine and smoke tested the entire EVAP system. And what I found is right in line with everything else that went wrong on this project. See, this is the charcoal canister purge valve. Now, again, we had replaced this fairly early on in the process, right around the same time that we replaced the charcoal canister itself. Now this one works the opposite way of the purge valve. When voltage is applied to it, it's supposed to be closed. And when there's no voltage applied to it, it's supposed to be wide open. Cool, we've established that when there's no voltage applied to it, it is in fact wide open. Great. Now what I realized when I smoke tested it was that when I sent the 12 volt signal to this valve and blew smoke through it, you could get smoke through it. It wasn't sealing completely. So once again, we were having an issue where it was letting air pass through when it shouldn't. And again, it needs to be a complete and total vacuum for the system to work properly. Now, properly is a very technical term that I use here, which is for the car to consider it to be working properly. Again, the system was probably working completely fine, and it's just because it runs certain checks to verify the vacuum integrity of the hoses and the valves that it threw a code. But otherwise, this car probably would have ran totally fine as it was. But once again, that charcoal canister vent valve was ordered off Amazon. It was another, $20 part. And again, another reminder, check your parts when you buy them to make sure that they work properly. Now I got really lucky on this one because when I ordered the charcoal canister itself, it came with another vent valve attached to it already. And I took that one off and just put it to the side in my parts storage, and I used the brand new one that we bought off Amazon instead of the OEM one that came on the canister. So at that point I decided, hey, let me test the OEM one and see if it works, hook 12 volts up to it. No air passes through whatsoever. It's completely airtight seal. So we installed that one back on the car, and all of the codes are gone. Now at this point, it has been 2 years since we started this process. It's been to 2 different mechanic shops and spent over 4 months in their lot. It spent the other 20 months sitting here in the garage waiting to be repaired and able to be driven without issues of it stalling. Now, I'm not going to toot my own horn here too much because I am an amateur mechanic, and when it comes to stuff like this, I had no idea what an EVAP system even was before I started working on it. But I would assume that a professional mechanic who does this as a full-time job might have been able to diagnose this a little bit quicker than what I did. And it spent 4 months at different mechanic shops, and nobody could tell us what was actually going wrong with it. And it was a pretty severe condition because if a car stalls out on the road, you don't want to drive it. So this car was unsafely driven for about 2 years dealing with the stall condition, all because nobody would take a little bit of extra time to diagnose what the actual problem was. Now the big question is, do I feel more accomplished because of the fact that I fixed this myself? And the answer is absolutely yes. I feel awesome. I did this for my sister. I didn't charge her for it. She paid for the parts. I did all the labor because I was determined to try and figure out what was wrong with this car. And now it's got a ton of new parts on it, and it'll probably run great for the next 150,000 miles given normal maintenance, oil changes, etc. And at the end of the day, the repairs that I think personally made the biggest difference was cleaning the throttle body, just so the engine could react properly to changes in the air-fuel ratio, the vapor canister itself that was completely saturated with liquid fuel, and then obviously the purge valve and the charcoal vent valve. To be completely honest, I don't think the transmission made a huge difference at all. Granted, again, it's a Nissan with the CVT transmission. These things are known to be horribly unreliable, so chances are the transmission would have had to be replaced anyway at some point. But for now, this car is fixed and it's going back out on the road to live another day. And that is how I fixed a problem that 2 mechanics told me was impossible to figure out. Now, if you like these kind of videos and you want to see me do more stuff with cars, like I said, I've got a 1975 Camaro back over there that's got a lot of work needing to be done to it. A whole lot more work than this car needed. So you should go ahead and subscribe and follow me along as I get all of my cars up and running again so I can enjoy them out on the open road. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.